Hi everyone, my name is Melanie and today I'm going to talk you through my project called Implementing Child Safeguard Best Practice in the Development Sector. So to give you a bit of an introduction to myself, as I said, my name is Melanie and I'm an external student. I work for Engineers Without Borders Australia and I'm based in Melbourne. My role is International Program Officer, so mostly I focus on operations and systems for our international program. So the focus of this project is around child safeguarding best practice. And so to give you a bit of background about what Engineers Without Borders does related to children, we have a few programs. One of them is a school outreach program, and that's conducted in Australia and also overseas. And that program involves volunteers and staff members going into primary and high schools and talking about humanitarian engineering, so there's very direct contact with children through that work. We also have design summits, which is a study tour program for university students, and part of that program involves going into communities for a 5-night homestay. So again, within those communities there are children who are vulnerable, and therefore there's some direct contact with children through that program. And then finally, in the international program, we place skilled field professionals who are typically engineering professionals into partner organisations in countries such as Cambodia and Timor-Leste. So again, through their project work, going out and working in communities, there's some contact with children in that element. So of course, making sure that we have the appropriate systems and processes in place to protect children and other vulnerable people is very important. So before I get started on talking about the actual project, I'll give some definitions to help clarify what I mean when I talk about safeguarding versus protection. So child safeguarding, according to Oxfam Australia, is what organisations do to keep children safe, and this is internal facing. Child protection, on the other hand, by Oxfam Australia, is the action taken by individuals, countries, governments, communities, families and civil society to protect children from all forms of abuse, neglect, exploitation and violence against children. So that's external facing. So EWB Australia doesn't actually have a definition for child safeguarding. However, our definition for child protection is an activity or initiative designed to protect children from any form of harm, particularly arising from child abuse or neglect. And so that's stated within our child protection policy, but obviously the key difference between the Oxfam Australia definition and the EWB Australia definition is that theirs is much broader in scope, and it also refers to exploitation and violence against children. So it might be something for EWB Australia to consider. So talk to you about why I am doing this project. So earlier in the year, there was essentially a scandal in the development sector around sexual misconduct of staff who were working in vulnerable communities in Haiti. So what that resulted in from governments and from other donors was a bit of an overhaul of child protection and child safeguarding measures, and that placed a lot of pressure on development organisations to review what practices and what systems they have in place and see how they can improve their child safeguarding. So that was a bit of a prompt. Courtney Columbus suggests that these aren't one-off incidents and that this kind of misconduct is quite frequent in the development sector. So if this is the case, I'd be interested to understand why international NGOs aren't better prepared and why we have to be so reactive in these scenarios rather than just responsive and able to say what we do. There has been a lot of reform in development organisations of their child protection policies and of their processes, which demonstrates that perhaps they weren't as prepared as we would like to be. So international NGOs are very dependent on donor funding, and donors obviously want quality assurance that their money is going to reputable organisations. So this is another reason why we need to make sure that the systems that we have in place are to a high standard. We are working in very vulnerable communities that may not have the infrastructure and mechanisms in place to be able to safeguard themselves and other people in their community. So we need to be able to step up, because there is obviously a power dynamic that exists between organisations delivering services and the people who are receiving those services. So ultimately, it's useful for me to understand how organisations identify whether they're operating in line with best practice and what information or method informs this belief that they are. So that's some of the background as to why I selected this project. So for this project, I had two main objectives. The first is to identify and reflect on best practice approaches and identify opportunities for improvement for EWB Australia. And the second is to develop strategies to ensure EWB Australia employees are aware of and can practically implement best practice in the development sector with that focus on child safeguarding. So you can see that there is an element of the research, and then there's also the element of providing those recommendations that will be effective in the long run. So what do I need to know in order to do this project? Well, I had 4 different research questions. The first being, what is considered best practice in safeguarding of children in the development sector? The second being, how does EWB Australia define best practice? The third being, how does EWB Australia measure its effectiveness against those best practice models, and what systems currently exist? And the fourth and final is, what approaches and strategies are the most effective for ensuring policy implementation in development organisations? So that fourth question is already making the assumption that policy implementation may not always be effective, and it can be quite challenging. So what am I doing? Well, I've divided what I'm doing into 3 different categories. I am researching, I'm mapping, and I'm reviewing. So researching, I've been conducting a literature review of academic literature, government publications and reports, NGO publications and reports, but then also looking over different development organisations' policies and procedures. Mapping, so I conducted 2 comparative exercises. One was that I conducted a comparative exercise against a Preventing Sexual Exploitation and Abuse guidance manual, and the second was a comparative exercise against the Oxfam Australia's 9 elements. So just trying to match up where EWB sits, because Oxfam Australia is quite a large, reputable organisation, and they do lead in child safeguarding practice. And then the Preventing Sexual Exploitation and Abuse manual is very new, and it's been a focus in the sector at least since the end of last year. So in terms of reviewing, I've been conducting compliance reviews of EWB Australia's practice, and also of our implementing partners' practice, because we are responsible for what they have in place as well in terms of what's required by our donors. So that helps me to identify the gaps in our operations and kind of match it back to this mapping and this research. Definitely one of the challenges that I've had in this project so far is that when looking at larger organisations and what they do, obviously they're much bigger. They might have more resources and capacity than EWB Australia. We are quite small. We have a team of about 20 staff, not including staff in our overseas locations, but we are quite small, and therefore these kinds of activities are quite resource intensive, and I think that might be reflecting why some of the operations at EWB Australia aren't quite as comprehensive as those in larger organisations. So in terms of some of the findings, so for the first research question on what is considered best practice in safeguarding of children in the development sector, so there are some things that I would naturally look to in terms of best practice, and that would be DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. They have 9 minimum standards, and as our largest source of income for our projects, we need to comply with those minimum standards in order to even receive funding and to be an accredited organisation who can be in receipt of funding but also operate in our overseas locations. The second go-to that I would look towards is the Australian Council for International Development, ACFID. So EWB Australia is a member of ACFID, and it is essentially codes of conduct of quality principles for Australian NGOs operating overseas. So they focus on these good practice principles that we can apply and that we can self-assess. So what else is considered best practice? Well, NGOs have a lot to say. It is at risk of being a little bit overwhelming because there's no universal best practice. Moss actually says that best practice needs to consider the context, the culture, the environment. And this is also supported by Feek, who argues that we can't just say that there is one best practice. We should be talking about good practice, because good practice implies that there can be different types. And again, same as Moss, that it can be in consideration of the environment, the population, the culture, the group. Something that has come through a lot of the literature is a good practice involves collaboration. It involves strong reporting mechanisms. It involves strong leadership. Good practice models being driven by leadership. But Brown identifies the challenge of different cultural perceptions of what constitutes something like abuse, for example, which highlights the importance of collaborative approaches in the development of policies and guidelines and practices, that what we say is good practice here and what we say constitutes bad practice actually needs to be identified locally and within the appropriate context, so that we are all on the same page when we are reading policies, when we are reading processes. So question 2, how does EWB define best practice? So what I've found so far is that EWB Australia actually doesn't define best practice. So that might reflect that they haven't been proactive in this space before and perhaps more reactive and looking to other organisations. So how do we know if our practice is best or even good? Well, we are guided by a few things. Obviously, being a ACFID member, we complete code self-assessment, so we're able to assess against these quality principles and good practice indicators of how we are measuring up. We obviously listen to our donors, so obviously DFAT is one of our largest donors, but if there are other donors as well who have requirements around the protection of people, then we're obviously reporting on those. So that's another way that we can measure and assess how we are doing in that space. Policy reviews, so obviously EWB Australia undertakes policy reviews. We did so last year in 2017 for our child protection policy. So obviously we'll do that in another couple of years, and that will be an opportunity for us to review what is current practice in the sector, any new laws or standards that have been introduced, and we'll incorporate these into new policies and processes. But what I've realised ultimately is that we don't really have a systematic approach. It's quite ad hoc in terms of reviews being undertaken, and it's typically being driven by one person based on their own motivation, not necessarily based on this is a system and we're all going to apply it at this particular time in the year. But we do have staff who attend communities of practice, who engage in working groups and focus groups and strategy meetings, but again, it's just not systematic. It does seem a little bit ad hoc at the moment. So in conclusion of that, I think we are heavily reliant on government and donor-driven requirements, so we are quite reactive, and perhaps we could improve in that space in being a little bit more proactive. So question 3, how does EWB measure its effectiveness against best practice models, and what systems currently exist? So as I've mentioned already, we have the code self-assessment, so we're assessing against the quality principles and best practice indicators. We have the accreditation process, which I'm currently leading, which is essentially Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade have determined criteria that we must then meet, and we must be able to demonstrate that we meet that criteria. We have an impact framework that we measure our projects and our programs against. And we have monitoring and reporting within each of those programs, although it's not necessarily addressing child safeguarding. Some of the systems that we have in place, we have a complaint system, an incident reporting system, and a whistleblowing system, and these all currently can track reports and can capture trends. Although something that I read through Morgan's literature was that this can be quite challenging for our partner organisations in terms of how accessible our mechanisms are, and in terms of cultural hierarchies, whether or not they feel comfortable making these reports to us, and some fears that might go alongside that in terms of if they reported something, they might lose support. So it's something that needs to be considered when we are developing systems and processes. How are these actually going to be used by the people that they are actually prepared for? So the last research question, what approaches and strategies are the most effective for ensuring policy implementation? As I said before, what's come through a lot of the text is around it being driven by management, about it being collaborative, about it involving the voice of children and young people, which is something that I know that we have not done very well. And also not having universal definitions for things, allowing flexibility, allowing for it to be adapted to the context. So again, around the literature that I've found for this policy implementation, Moss is suggesting that there is little connection made between development policy and the context to which it applies. So this is, again, strengthening the argument that we need to collaborate. We need to include the voice of the people that are going to be using the process or the policy, and also those who are going to be impacted by it. Cabra talks about the tensions as well, so replicating what Moss is saying around policy implementation, and in this discussion it was around land rights. It was talking about how NGOs can overspecify and create really detailed, comprehensive manuals that are very, very hard to follow, but they often miss the point, they miss the target group because they're not actually accessible. And in the House of Commons report, they talked about how NGOs apply surface level changes, such as policies and codes of conduct, but they're not adequately implemented. So there really does seem to be evidence here in the literature that there is a big gap between policies and implementation, and how we bridge that gap might be through increased collaboration, increased focus groups and translations of materials, things like that. So I think that's something I need to continue to look into. So in terms of child safeguarding frameworks that I've come across, the two that I just want to talk about right now is Oxfam Australia, because I have been referring to them a lot in my work and obviously in this presentation, and the Australian Government's focus. So Oxfam Australia have a framework that's based around awareness, preventing, responding and reporting. And the Australian Government is around governance, managing risk, managing for results, and enhancing transparency. So it's very useful to have these frameworks because it clarifies the priorities and it suggests a process and the types of activities required. EWB Australia doesn't currently have a safeguarding framework, it just has the policy and some of the implementation areas, but this is something that I think would be a recommendation going forward for EWB Australia, is to actually put this into something tangible that can then be incorporated into program designs and program frameworks. So to give you my opinion and some of my recommendations at this point, so our strengths are that we have a very comprehensive child protection policy and we have robust screening and recruitment processes, but there are definitely some areas for improvement. So opportunities would be around having a focal person. I see in a lot of the policies and a lot of the processes of other development organisations, they do have that focal point, and that's very useful for people to direct their questions and to know where to go and to know that it is a focus of the organisation. I think we also need to be publicising our position on child safeguarding, which we don't currently do. We need to be considering the terminology. Are we talking about child safeguarding or are we just talking about child protection? There were some key differences. And also thinking about good practice versus best practice. We need to be offering training to staff and also to our partner organisations and making the material that we provide accessible and easy to digest. That has been one of the challenges that is occurring with implementing policies, is that the language is very wordy and it's not transferable, it's not translatable, not only just in other cultures and in other languages, but it does need to be plain English. I think we need to strengthen how we support and monitor our implementing partners, as through the comparative exercise, it's evident that we don't do this very well at the moment and it is very ad hoc. Engaging children and young people in the process, as I spoke about earlier, that's something that really needs to be considered when we're developing our policies and developing our reporting mechanisms, and strengthening our risk management and monitoring as well, because we haven't actually had a focus on child safeguarding and child protection in our risk management reviews in the past. So what am I going to do now? I'm going to go back to the objectives of my project and consider how the research and the opportunities that I've identified can turn into real recommendations. I'm going to also look at some of the larger organisations which I'm currently doing, such as Save the Children, Plan, Child Fund, and continue to look at Oxfam as well, and see how we can apply some of these approaches to EWB Australia. Thank you very much.